Ahora mi mamá nos prepara la comida más rica del mundo. ¡Qué rico! Me gusta. En su huerta hay muchas plantas y zanahorias que me gustan mucho. Y es por eso que soy muy grande y fuerte. Pero yo no soy la única. Los estudios decían que sufriríamos desnutrición, igual que nuestros papás y mamás, y que por eso no podríamos seguir estudiando. Pero mi papá dice que ahora todo es diferente. Ellos aprendieron a cuidarse y cuidarnos mejor. Aunque ahora no vamos a la escuela todos los días, nosotros también estamos aprendiendo. Tenemos padrinos que aunque vivan muy lejos de aquí, apoyan a nuestras familias y nos envían cartas. Y nosotros también a ellos. Gracias a ellos, Vicky, Goyito y Raúl pueden seguir enseñándonos a ser más grandes y fuertes. Pero en mi comunidad no todos los niños son igual de fuertes. Y por la pandemia muchos dejaron de estudiar. Por eso necesitamos a más padrinos que nos quieran ayudar, aunque vivan muy lejos de aquí. Porque cuando apadrinas a un niño, transforma.
Nayan Canadela con 34 años. Makas lefe achan maka ako naka-okeng sa lakakaleban. Anak kan antes de Dios con chica okeng sa lakakaleban. Nawam chiri shut chiri she bisbal kakukal. Ushil maka bisok. La olish chochi elbaya kashuri in atinak nash kwan maka anak ko atinak ta chirish ko nakikawilan.
Doña Adela es madre voluntaria del Grupo Cascada de Santa Ana Oriental. Doña Adela es muy activa por su comunidad, ha dado su tiempo para el desarrollo de los niños menores de 5 años. Ella prepara a las madres para la atención de sus hijos, lo hace con mucho amor y también ha esforzado por sus propios hijos. Entonces se ve la diferencia de la participación de ella, porque sí lo aplica en su hogar. Entonces, gracias a Dios que ella es una madre que sí entiende lo que es el cambio para su comunidad y por su familia.
Likaro nakakwat sa komunili ni ko sa ekana Marielena ut linasaw kinjol pos nanakon na enchik kuya shibakan kaush chikots bale kanale brikim li sahil na ben lito kep chichalk pos arapan na saw inchol re truk tingiali bakwan yo ke solbal chiho ki chirish li kyu amla in chirish li kola li kahol truk kakiti okang li bakwan yo kish tau alba yakiru tingke bichak chaklia tanakon li jokin tau aliruna tiruang ke ale bayakhnale ut chok ke kiri kene mingo kalulah ka behnak mare li dios lingu amerikene mare char kwali ut tos tiruang ke ale re li bakwa jokish tau alain.
Yo participo en el comité de seguridad. Durante los 2 años aquí estamos todo tranquilo con los vecinos, aquí no hay problemas, que entonces ya pasamos los años sin ninguna novedad. Le agradezco bastante al FH pues, que le diera en cuenta a mi hijo por el cabo, pues, porque como le conté, seguir en adelante. Si la educación no va a tener en nuestro país, el patojo va a quedar atrás, ¿va? Sin educación no podemos hacer nada. Con educación podemos sacar en adelante.
Sí, mi nombre es Miguel Ángel Leonardo Mason, tengo 14 años, estoy en segundo básico. Me siento feliz por los útiles que nos ha dado FH, el kit de higiene nos permite seguir estudiando.
Sain chol chio keng sa di grupo ga. Di rusil nak ningkula linsentan la hep ketsal. Ut nak kwa hinto ning am hinto ni lo relinchina negocio. Ni lo en si ni lo en ishemut. Tos menas que igual li naruchin chikaan hanap chikri kinep linko kas chikli bakwan ni si ni YouTube tos re chikstole walin. Di rusil nak social maka ni lo otono kan sin lo kunin chinapila. Quise pues cosas pues que vas lo bajo moto le kawachin ya no podemos estar.
Desde que FH está en esta comunidad, pues las madres ya están empoderadas en la atención de sus hijos. Pues gracias a Dios ya se ve los cambios que están teniendo, porque ahora los padres de familia ya motivan a sus hijos para asistir a las escuelas y atiende bien a sus hijos en la alimentación. Lo más importante, los niños están creciendo bien.
Makachak li FH kon ko chakaran chi makana kana chiris li kawilal utanakon jahe utanakon yokep chikchi takai ko yak liralan la olish to chi elbaya kashiwri in atinak nash kwan olisenyo alba na kolon shke bal chanirush shke bal bayak ko unale shkawush ko kachaniro teon ko unale ba negiri kilinjum nakon usna el kachik nash kana bis clase tos nashik ni elish khonar el shik ben kwala kana kili kwanza di básico na hula krab benkil kumarane ke shkotakirati ni Dios nashkul charlis charla rahla alfo nishtan am nakwana na ke chak wayak shu tos ak algo kole wayak chikirish kharbakh chikin katal ani rusil li kwanza li básico atek tachasa khona qotam no koshik na bale ke filal nek ke kashiw fi atinak shbanun kilish kan khair.
En Alta Verapaz, la comunidad chioya es el hogar de Jasmine Hidalgo, de 9 años.
Cuando FH inició a trabajar en esta comunidad, había mucha enfermedad entre los niños, diarreas, resfriados y mala higiene en las madres. Sí, había bastante desnutrición, descuido en los niños en cuanto a su desarrollo, tanto alimenticio como en el área de educación también. La desnutrición afecta a los niños porque eso provoca falta de concentración en los niños. Muchas veces los niños vienen de su hogar y vienen sin desayuno y eso provoca que ellos no pongan atención en sus clases, que no tengan un rendimiento adecuado dentro de su proceso de aprendizaje.
Todos los niños deberían tener la oportunidad no solo de vivir, sino de soñar y tener acceso a salud integral. Fundación contra el Hambre ha creado programas como Manitas a la Obra, que facilitan el desarrollo de sus habilidades. Y a través de estos programas, familias como las de Jasmine son alentadas a vivir una fe profundamente enraizada.
Gracias al apoyo de FH, los niños ya tienen más sueños. En la clase de principios de valores ellos se han dado cuenta que son importantes, que su vida vale.
Sueños como este son posibles gracias a patrocinadores como tú, que ayudan a empoderar a estas comunidades.
A través del patrocinio entre los niños y los patrocinadores se ha visto una relación más unida, porque los niños les escriben cartitas, dibujitos, y ellos también les mandan fotos, e incluso vienen a visitarlos. Eso ha ayudado y motivado a que los niños puedan alcanzar más sus sueños.
Los niños de Chioya van tras esos sueños cada día, y para Jasmine es ponerse un par de tenis para alcanzar su meta.
Ahora mi mamá nos prepara la comida más rica del mundo. ¡Qué rico! Me gusta. En su huerta hay muchas plantas y zanahorias que me gustan mucho. Y es por eso que soy muy grande y fuerte. Pero yo no soy la única. Los estudios decían que sufriríamos desnutrición, igual que nuestros papás y mamás, y que por eso no podríamos seguir estudiando. Pero mi papá dice que ahora todo es diferente. Ellos aprendieron a cuidarse y cuidarnos mejor. Aunque ahora no vamos a la escuela todos los días, nosotros también estamos aprendiendo. Tenemos padrinos que, aunque vivan muy lejos de aquí, apoyan a nuestras familias y nos envían cartas. Y nosotros también a ellos. Gracias a ellos, Vicky, Goyito y Raúl pueden seguir enseñándonos a ser más grandes y fuertes. Pero en mi comunidad no todos los niños son igual de fuertes. Y por la pandemia muchos dejaron de estudiar. Por eso necesitamos a más padrinos que nos quieran ayudar, aunque vivan muy lejos de aquí. Porque cuando apadrinas a un niño, transformas.
Señoras, señores, buenos días.
Good morning. I want to welcome you to our second day of the Forum for Resilience, Building Resilience in Indigenous Women and Girls.
Que está ocurriendo en la ciudad, pero daremos inicio a nuestro evento. Este evento titulado del cambio climático en las mujeres y niñas indígenas de Guatemala, desarrollado en el marco de celebración del Día Internacional de las Mujeres Indígenas y público en general presente. Nuevamente queremos invitarles a apagar sus teléfonos o mantenerlos en modo silencio durante la realización del evento. A continuación tendremos las palabras de bienvenida de parte de la licenciada Michelle González Mendía. Recibámosla con un fuerte aplauso.
Welcome her with a big round of applause.
Muy buenos días a todos.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for being here with us in our second day of the forum. For us, it's such a joy to see your faces and get to know you and put a face on the emails. And now we will be able to remind the tone of your voice, your smiles, and all the learning we've shared this week. We're about to finish the first step of this initiative, and I want to encourage you to continue sharing your experience and the knowledge you have. And why are we doing that? Is because we recognize the vulnerability of our country, we recognize the inequality and the social exclusion that our peoples have suffered, especially women, but we also acknowledge their strength, their resilience, and that they're agents of change in their communities. So today we're going to have different activities, and we're going to continue with the work that we started yesterday. We're going to continue learning, and right now I'm going to share with you the next steps of this initiative. So thank you very much. Be welcome. Thank you.
La agenda a desarrollar el día de hoy durante nuestro segundo día de encuentro. Después de nuestras palabras de
the
bienvenida,
schedule for today
la presentación del impacto del cambio climático
the following. We're going to have a presentation from the Office for the Defense of the Indigenous Women. Then we will have a presentation of resilience capacities by Lauren Woodside. And after that, we will have a presentation of the initiative called the Interinstitutional Roundtable. Then we will have a coffee break. And after that, we're going to see our documentary, the English version. And then we will develop the topic Building the Resilience, and building the resilience and evaluating the risks and the capacities. And finally, we are going to go back to our work tables and continue with the analysis that started yesterday, the analysis on the different topics analysis. And we will be working with the World Cafe methodology. Then we will have our lunchtime. And in the afternoon, we're going to go back to our work tables and our exercises. Then we will have another learning panel that will be facilitated by many of the participants of this event. And finally, we are going to be closing our event, and we will have the photography's gallery exposition. I would like to welcome our next speaker. Her name is Gloria Evelyn Dalila Curuchich Simon. She's a lawyer and notary graduated from San Carlos University of Guatemala, and she has a master's degree in human rights obtained from the Rafael Andivar University, Deputy Director of Legal Care Unit of the Comprehensive Care Area in the Ombudsman for Indigenous Women since 2008, University Professor at the Faculty of Legal and Social Sciences at the Central Campus of Rafael Andivar University since 2010, speaker at seminars, forums, and training workshops on the rights of indigenous peoples, indigenous women, and specific rights. She is a participant in national and international meetings on attention to indigenous women. Let's welcome with a big round of applause to Licenciada Curuchich Simon.
Bueno, muy buenos días a cada uno de
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to share with you the experience that we've had at the Office for the Defense of the Indigenous Women, and I'm going to also be sharing some of the challenges that we have and some of the accomplishments we've had in our interventions. So we're going to start our presentation on the impact of climate change in indigenous. When we speak about climate change, we know that we are against time. We're running against time. And we've been talking about all the effects of climate change. And we should know that everything that we're promoting in favor of the resilience of the indigenous peoples are topics and are things that we need to address. In the case of indigenous women, their participation in their context is very specific, as we're going to learn today. We know that climate change is a way of life of all of us, women and men. And when we say women and men, we mean indigenous peoples, because indigenous peoples have had a participation, and we're going to see what this participation have been. So we must consider that the participation that the indigenous peoples have had is not the same as the participation that the indigenous women have had. So this is a topic that we're going to address today, noting that the situation of indigenous women is different because their context is different. First, we know that we're part of that collective of indigenous peoples, but we're also part of the group of women, indigenous women. And sometimes we get lost in that because when we say that we are indigenous peoples, indigenous women have not been helped in a specific way. And when we hear about the feminist groups, we don't find a feminist group that is dedicated specifically to indigenous women. Men and women are affected in different ways. We already talked about the different participation each of these groups have. So, starting from the social construction of gender roles, we're going to find that the participation of indigenous women, girls, and teenagers has a direct effect in the usage of resources. So when we talk about indigenous women, we not only see this day as natural resources, but also agents. We know that land is a natural resource, and it's a resource that obviously helps us to get the means of life, but it's also a different connection that women have with land. So we're going to see how this affects the vision we have of the different populations that live around the world. So we need to start talking about the impact that women, indigenous women and girls specifically have. The impact of climate change in indigenous women and girls. But before starting, we need to define what is an indigenous woman, who is an indigenous woman. We cannot find this definition in a dictionary that can define what an indigenous woman is. Who is an indigenous? We need to pay attention to the way we are seen by our society and the way we have seeked to be recognized by society. How? Is through the auto-identification. We cannot say this is an indigenous woman and this is not an indigenous woman, just because some of them speak the language and others don't. It's not only that, it's that richness and that culture, that that special characteristic that indigenous women have. So we should start by asking women, how do they identify themselves? If we assume from our worldview, if we assume the definition of indigenous woman, we cannot understand the effect of climate change in them, because within the institutionality, we have instruments or documents where we gather information from, and this information has been gathered through observation. When we have a program, we have to identify who is the person who is receiving this service. And sometimes it's this person, the beneficiary, who fills up the forms. And the indigenous women categories have been built and have been isolated from the same indigenous people's context. So when I ask an indigenous woman, what is your town, and what is your ethnic group, or what ethnic group do you come from? And we're expecting them to answer, I am Xinca or Garifuna or Mayan, and she's going to respond, I'm from San Juan Comalapa. Why? Because her response and her answer is not the same, and her idea is not the same from the idea that the society established. So, what are the effects that the indigenous women have had? We know what are those effects because it has been visible, and we've seen the effects, because these are vulnerable groups, women, girls, and teenagers. We know that they're part of those groups, of those vulnerable groups that continue to be affected in a much greater way by climate change. So we're going to find discrimination, inequality, and exclusion, which are the greater three limitations that indigenous women have. And they are and many of them are not aware of their rights. So when we speak about the effects, we need to have the definition of inequality clear. And for this, we need to address the gender roles. And we know that in Guatemala, women and girls have the responsibility that has been imposed to them to take charge and be in charge of the use of the natural resources like water. We know that in most of our communities, they don't have drinkable water, and the children, the girls and the teenagers are the ones in charge of go and look for water to cook and clean. And we know that inequality and gender roles lower the capacity and the life quality of women, of indigenous women, because we want them to have a life with dignity and worthy conditions. It's not only about having beans to eat, it goes beyond that. We want them to have the livestock and the livelihood to live a quality of life, a life of quality. So in the case of climate change, it impacts them and puts them in a vulnerable condition, more vulnerable than other groups in Guatemala. We must take into account that this also has economic consequences. And economic consequences are when we see those consequences when they don't have access to employment, or when they don't have access to the basic services that the state provide. So they have to go and seek for the necessary means to survive. So those economic conditions lead to violence against women. And this is very interesting because when we speak about climate change, we can think that it's about natural resources, water, temperature. But however, the social context of indigenous women, we can see violence against them. Why? Because violence against women impacts women in different ways, especially indigenous women. So when we speak about violence against women, we must take into account that this causes other type of situations, other impacts in the life of each woman. When we see these social and economic factors, we see that indigenous women live in a very specific situation, in a very specific context within Guatemala. So these social factors that I've mentioned, their historic context, and many of us don't know their historic context and social context that can allow women to be part of this decision-making process. Women has been isolated, and sometimes we only see women as victims. And we know that it's a recurrent victim of history, but besides that, women have a lot of potential and have a lot to give to their community. We know that women have limited access to basic service, and we're going to see a survey performed by the Institution of National Statistics. And we can find here that women have limited access to water, sewage system, and energy. There are very clear effects of climate change, and one of them is that water is limited. And in the case of the Mayan, Garifuna, and Xinca peoples are the ones who have less water, less access to water. And this is what I was saying before, that they are not the ones responsible of climate change, but they are the ones who have limited access to basic service. And in the case of sewage system, the situation is not that bad, but it contradicts itself, because if we have water and we don't have a sewage system, a drainage system, and if we see the energy graphic, what does this mean? All of these machines need energy to function. But these are not things that indigenous people use. So we must find this balance so all of the situations that are affecting and are increasing the climate change effects in indigenous women can be lowered. So when we speak about discrimination, and why is it important to continue speaking about discrimination? In the case of indigenous women, they are discriminated against, not only because they're women, but because they are indigenous. And this is not the same, and this doesn't happen the same way to all of us. Many of women who have had access to education, maybe perhaps they don't suffer discrimination in the same way, but in different ways. So there's discrimination against women and against indigenous women, and also against certain age groups. In Guatemala, there's a great rate of young population. So we must seek the way to include them in our strengthening efforts. You saw in the video that Natalia, the little girl, went out and picked up an egg and prepared it and cooked the egg with any problem. But in the case of the boys, they don't have this experience, they don't have these skills and knowledge. And if we compare the teenagers who live in the city area and the teenagers who live in the rural areas, their context is totally different. The teenagers from the city know a lot about social media and popular bands, but teenagers in the rural areas, they know more about allowed us to have a better way of life, better context. So we know that there's an impact on indigenous women, and even has serious consequences on these populations. So vulnerability is not the fact of being a woman, are the conditions of the social and structural impact that maintain her and keep the women in a vulnerable condition. Then the other problem is that they are not decision makers. We see that in Food for the Hungry, we've learned that Food for the Hungry is seeking to strengthen this leadership. So people and women have that leadership skills and they can use them as decision makers in their community. Climate change is comprehensive in nature as it has comprehensive impact on indigenous women. And as I was saying before, it's not only about economic resources, but also other social other social components. Indigenous women are more vulnerable, but they are not responsible for climate change. And we see this when they are not part of the statistics, and we can think that they are not there because they're not responsible. But it's the opposite. They are the ones who are most impacted by climate change effects. It can be considered that violence against women is one of the aspects of climate change because it risks health, food, land, and natural elements, and even life. Let's remember that when we speak about territories, it's not only a physical space, but there is a different connection with land, and this must be defended. And we've seen that this has formation of gender roles where women transmit and communicate from generation to generation, and there's knowledge that is lost, and this loss breaks with the resilience practices. So we must take into account that women must value this ancestral knowledge, and sometimes they're not valued because they are practices where there is enough evidence that these practices have had positive results. In the topic of health, that there has been an appearance of new diseases like the case of COVID-19, which is a recent event that impacted indigenous women in a different way. And we saw that indigenous peoples had a different resilience because they had a survival mechanisms different from the ones in the cities. Because in these cities, there are not crops, there are not gardens, there are not vegetables for the family consumption. So this new disease highlighted the resilience mechanisms of indigenous peoples. The double discrimination, as I was saying, we see that because women adapt to climate change. And then the worldview of the different peoples. The vision we have of land is different. It's different for everyone. Some of us have or see land as an economic resource, but for indigenous people, we know that nature is our motherland, and we respect it and we use it in a careful way, in a wise way. So what we saw yesterday, what we learned yesterday, are the ways in which indigenous women are impacted in a collective way. However, when we see the effects of climate change, we find that these effects are different for each of the groups. And there are different problems and problems that have not had a solution. So in the climate change effects, as we can see here in the slide, we have the floods, the droughts, and extreme climate change. These problems affect indigenous women in a different way. I have a couple of examples here for you. First, we have the natural disasters like material losses, for example, housing. Women lose absolutely everything. They lose even the basic instruments, cooking instruments. Women lose their clothing. And when we speak about those identity elements, we know that it goes beyond the language, but all the context in which women develop. There's malnutrition, limited access to education, famine, as we see what is happening right now at the dry corridor. Sadly, the institutional response has been limited because institutions don't know the context in which women develop and communities develop. If we don't know the context, we won't be able to give a response and a good response. So natural disasters cause more poverty. And many indigenous peoples have tried to fix this problem, and that leads to forced migration. Why? Because the state tells them, okay, we're going to respond to your territory need, but they sell them to a community, very isolated community, so there's a loss of identity elements. There's a situation that there's these initiatives that are not able to fulfill all the needs of the indigenous women. There's also a break with their cultural and natural environment and land dispossession. For example, mining. Besides climate change, we know how mining projects like extractions and all those projects who use natural resources are impacting indigenous groups. And we link this to the defense of the territory and how this defense have been criminalized. The loss of crops, properties, livestock, and all the family consumption. We know that many times what the state does is that they seek an immediate measure and an immediate solution that only lasts for a month. But after that, what does the family do and how do they survive if they don't have access to resources, to basic resources? And we can not forget about human losses. And for this, we should note that indigenous women are impacted by this because when the provider dies, women are the ones who have to take charge of this responsibility. Responsibility of supporting their families and also to search for an income. And they become single parent families. And this doesn't allow them to get an employment. Why? Because they cannot leave the house because they have to take care of their children. So it all starts with a climate change effect, but it changes along the way. It progresses along the way. So women have to search for legal, social, and psychological services. Like, for example, during the armed conflict in Guatemala, women needed this psychological service to help them cope with this conflict. And we know that in this indigenous context, women were not able to, and it was not easy for them to get this kind of help because many of them don't know how to access to that. And maybe we can say psychology and climate change, does this relate? But because of the losses that indigenous women have, they need the psychological service and the psychological help. And I found a study from a university from Spain that in 2018 wrote this. It is not the physical event, floods, droughts, high temperatures, that alone determine who wins and who loses. It is the political reactions. There are the political reactions, the social interpretations, the discourses of analysis that produce, reproduce, and amplify social inequalities. Thus, the impact of climate change is different according to social class, ethnicity, gender, age, and other factors of social vulnerability, not only between society, but also within each society. But the proposals for mitigation and adaptation to climate change are not always the most successful, specifically in relation to social impact. So, to finish my presentation, I want to leave you with this. It is important to understand, recognize, and report on the differentiated impacts of climate change in relation to indigenous women, girls, and teenagers. So it is very important that we strengthen the leadership that is already existing in indigenous communities, so they can lead their communities in mitigating the effects of climate change. Why is this necessary? Because if we understand the indigenous women context, we will be able to see and accomplish and make them part of this active process. And also, we know that they have proposals. We know that they have the capacities, but they have not had the space. So that has been the limitation. But if we take their context into account, I believe that we can move forward on these efforts of improving the quality of life of indigenous women, and therefore the way they participate within these efforts, these national and international efforts. And with this, I finish my presentation. Thank you for your time and your attention. Thank you, Licenciada Kuruchich, for your excellent presentation. I would like to thank the Office for the Defense of Indigenous Women for the work you do and how you support this forum. So, thank you on behalf of Food for the Hungry. Right now, we'll have the presentation of what is resilience, what are the resilience capacities by Lauren Woodside from Food for the Hungry. Let's welcome her with a big round of applause. It's a pleasure to see you today. We have a video and we would like to introduce some introduction. Let me tell you that during this 8 or 7 years, we have taken about resilience for the hungry. And especially after the pandemic. Now we have using the lens how to see those conflicts to see in order to have a resilient and development community. So I'm going to introduce this video so we can have a better idea.
A family walks along a path. Like many others in extreme poverty, they are starting a very difficult journey to find a better life. As they travel, they will have little to protect themselves from wind, rain, floods, extreme heat, and drought. They will be in constant danger from flood paths, the scorching sun, and nearby fighting. One child gets sick, and the family will have to stop to care for their ailing one. Exhausted and nearing collapse, nearby villagers rush to their aid. The family is cared for, and life in the community is good, until drought and disease threaten the stability of the village. What seemed like a journey to safety now feels like a crushing cycle for the family and community. How does a family and community like this move from fragility to lasting resilience in the face of these hardships? And how should we in the development community respond? Historically, international aid has focused on meeting human needs through life-saving humanitarian interventions or long-term poverty reduction and economic growth strategies. Yet, what happens when there's a disaster, price shock, conflict, or global pandemic? All of the good work of development is disrupted, as are people's lives and livelihoods, like this family and community. COVID-19 is a perfect example of this, undercutting development gains, plunging millions back into poverty, threatening stability, exacerbating food crises, and overwhelming the capacity of already fragile health systems to tackle other disease outbreaks. To help fragile contexts and vulnerable populations as they face these compounding crises and risks, we need a new development approach. For communities to move from fragility to resilience, they must be able to absorb shocks and stress, such as through microinsurance, psychosocial support networks, and savings groups. People also need the capacity to adapt in the face of crises. This can be a farmer who has varied income sources in case her livelihood is disrupted by drought, or a social safety net that can help the poorest to weather difficult times. With varied income sources, the family we're following may not have needed to start on their journey to begin with. A resilience approach also involves transforming formal systems and institutions, like national social protection programs and health systems that can adapt during crises. With access to formal support during the drought, our family could have recovered, making the drought a temporary setback rather than a livelihood devastation. To promote these coping and transformative capacities for resilience, a development community must focus on social capital, which as evidence shows is the driver of resilience. This involves bonding within communities, which we saw with the family when the community took them in, bridging across communities, and linking between communities and formal institutions for more inclusive access to information, resources, and responsive action. Food for the Hungry has made resilience a central focus of its work with vulnerable communities, supporting social capital to promote their coping and transformative capacities in the most fragile places. Discover more about what FH has learned over its more than 50 years of strengthening resilience in fragile contexts.
Espero que las palabras se van rápido y se puede leer. Pero creo que con este video se entiende y se pinta una imagen de cómo es ese ciclo de desarrollo que luego una familia se enfrenta con una crisis. Y se describe también, yo sé que acá estamos enfocados en las crisis que tienen naturaleza climática por el cambio climático.
Related or oriented
Pero,
to climate change effects.
Pero no solamente son temas de cambio climático
It's not only
que
about
pueden
it,
afectar a una familia. Y a veces ni son cosas
these factors that
que
can
afectan
affect the
toda una
family,
comunidad, ¿no? Es una serie de
not
eventos,
only to the
enfermedad,
community, but it
una
also
pérdida
involves
de un bien en particular.
illnesses, loss of families or
No sé si
relatives.
podemos bajar eso un poquito. Ok. Tengo un poquito de un eco, por eso que... ah, pero ese es algo que hemos estado... ¿no? Parece que que ese ciclo que pasa a una familia que está deteniendo su proceso de desarrollo y transformación completo, ¿no? Para tener una vida plena como es el enfoque de FH Guatemala, tenemos que tener otra manera de trabajar, ¿no? Entonces, en FH hemos desarrollado ese marco como guía hacia lo que nosotros llamamos la resiliencia compartida, ¿no? Porque no podemos enfocar en una sola familia y ver un cambio en una sola familia sin pensar en todo el sistema que está a su alrededor. Igual con la mujer indígena, ¿no? Queremos ver como mayor resiliencia para ellas. Tenemos que ver todo el sistema y cómo funciona. Y hace 15 años, quizás cuando hablamos de resiliencia, la gente hubiera pensado, ok, estamos hablando de cómo podemos ayudar a que la gente adapte para que no pierdan sus cultivos. Pero es mucho más complejo de eso, ¿no? Me encantó escuchar la señora de Demi explicando, ¿no? Que hay todos estos factores culturales, sociales, que son tan importantes. Y en FH también vemos esas cosas que son muy importantes, ¿no? Porque uno de los valores de FH es que reconocemos que el trabajo de cambio de personas, de sistemas, es relacional, ¿no? Nuestro trabajo es relacional. Y vemos que nuestro rol es en ayudar arreglar esas relaciones. Y ese es a través de fomentando esa cohesión social que se hablaba en el video. Y realmente vemos en varios estudios que es una parte súper importante para el tema de resiliencia. O sea, tú puedes tener un proyecto muy bonito que enfoca en adaptación, pero sin la parte de cohesión social, ese interdependencia y apoyo entre comunidades, dentro de una comunidad, y también entre la población de esa comunidad y las instituciones, cohesión social,
Institution that social cohesion replicated to others, it's not going to be sustainable. So for us, we focus on this shared resilience feature system through all the people involved in the program to have social cohesion. And we can see that in different topics like we were sharing yesterday in the documentary and the saving groups. And you could see women that are having a resource income to increase their incomes in order to invest to an entrepreneurship, but beside that there is a support between them. So the area that we are focused is to strengthen those capacities. As we saw the video about absorption, adaptation, and transformation. That through different projects. It is not only a farming area or livelihoods. We want to see adaptation in the social area. Adaptation in health, adaptation in education, and how to strengthen the capacities on those areas so there is a higher capacity of absorption. And after every crisis, like the pandemic, for example, we can have opportunities and those capacities to absorb. And we can see this in the education system. Around the world, education topic, it's difficult to talk about. We have seen some problems, and maybe we have an education system with capacities for the different crises. We hope to have them. So that's work that we have been doing at FH to work alongside the education system in order to adapt to the crisis.
Another area that we see that it's very important in order to have a shared resilience in the system is to have information and understanding. So we're working on that to do research about resilience. As the engineer Medina presented yesterday, we know that there are many limits, and that's something that we know that we're not to do just by ourselves, but we need the help of others. So it's important to the innovate partnership, because in that way we're going to learn from each other and on the same system, share those knowledge to know what's the resilience about, what factors involved. So we don't understand just in one perspective, but in an inclusive way, involving culture, the strengths of people, of vulnerable people. We know that they have a lot, but we need to understand them. So that's something that we need to do as a group. Another topic in our framework is the climate change. We have to talk about climate change topics, the effects that it produces to women and girls, but that is not enough. We could see yesterday that there were many conversations about vulnerable people, and we know that it is not the root of the main problem. As international organization, we know that we have some partners around the world, but what is our role? How can we promote that the things need to change? We know that we focus on community area, but we don't have to stay there. We need to move and to think about the use of items or tools we have. And luckily, we have our own effects and also our contribution to the climate change. How can we reduce that problem? It's very important. And the last part in our framework is how to align our system so we can help all of the areas in a holistic way. So that's a little bit that we're understanding resilience, how we are adapting as an organization, how to improve our work so we can have a shared resilience in just one system. So thank you very much.
Que son esenciales para ella. A continuación, tendremos la presentación de la Mesa Interinstitucional para fomentar la resiliencia multidimensional y compartida de la mujer y niña indígena. Recibamos con un fuerte aplauso a la licenciada Michelle González Mendía de Food for the Hungry.
Yo me siento muy alegre y entusiasmada de escuchar a la licenciada Kuruchich y todo lo que hemos estado aprendiendo el día de hoy, el día de ayer. Muchas gracias, licenciada Lauren. Y en estos breves minutos, yo solamente quiero invitarlos. Food for the Hungry está comprometida como organización a aprender de ustedes, a aprender y adaptarnos para ser relevantes y ser como una institución que viene a promover la resiliencia multidimensional en Y nosotros estamos muy entusiasmados de aunar esfuerzos con más organizaciones, además de DEMI, la Ruta, el Ministerio de Ambiente y Recursos Naturales y otros a unirse, porque la tarea es muy grande, no podemos solos. Y si realmente queremos hacer la diferencia y estamos comprometidos como organizaciones, debemos de aunar esfuerzos. Después de este encuentro, vamos a sistematizar toda la información e invitarlos a ustedes a ser parte de esa reflexión. Todos los grupos han estado trabajando en mucha riqueza de conocimiento y cada día, cada momento estamos viendo cuáles son las brechas más importantes. Food for the Hungry está invirtiendo en una investigación de cambio climático en estos momentos enfocado en la mujer, y todo lo que se está generando información durante este encuentro va a ser parte de esa investigación, que va a ser segregada por sexo en mujeres indígenas, hombres, para poder tener más data, y de allí compartirles también con ustedes y identificar qué sigue, qué debemos de hacer. Las brechas, la licenciada Kovichis lo mostró muy claramente, lo hemos visto en las mesas de trabajo también. La mesa interinstitucional va a tener el objetivo básicamente de promover este aprendizaje, definir acciones. ¿Qué sigue? ¿Qué vamos a hacer? Esto no queda aquí. Y compartir también todos los resultados, hacer mapeos juntos, no solamente los riesgos, sino de las capacidades, de la riqueza. La licenciada Kovichis también hemos estado aprendiendo. Hay una riqueza inmensa de todo el conocimiento ancestral, la fortaleza de la mujer indígena como agente transformador dentro de sus familias, comunidades. Y así, a través de alianzas, podemos promover iniciativas, proyectos y apoyo institucional para informar políticas, para informar inversión y programación para el fortalecimiento de los sistemas a nivel del país, que puedan tener en el centro a la persona. Este enfoque multidimensional y compartido lo que busca es no enfocarse en un pedacito de la persona, sino en el todo de la persona. Porque nuestra organización relacional y nuestro enfoque es enfocarnos en la persona como un todo y no solo una sección de ella. Y quiero aprovechar este momento para agradecer a nuestros socios estratégicos, Defensoría de Mujeres Indígenas, la señora defensora y todo su equipo. Muchísimas gracias por estar apoyándonos, y seguimos y estamos entusiasmados de cuál es el siguiente paso, qué vamos a hacer en conjunto. La Ruta, que es la organización que trabaja y es la interfase entre pueblos indígenas y cooperación internacional. Estamos muy comprometidos y agradecidos con ustedes por su apoyo. Y el Ministerio de Ambiente y Recursos Naturales, muchísimas gracias, y seguimos comprometidos con todos ustedes. Y acá la invitación es a unirse a nosotros, continuar el diálogo, a seguir aprendiendo y compartiendo recursos para fortalecer la resiliencia multidimensional de la mujer, de la adolescente y niña indígena. En sus folders tendrán una hoja que dice Alianza Estratégica. Siéntanse libertad de llenarla si ustedes quieren ser parte de esta mesa interinstitucional, para poderlos convocar en la siguiente reunión que tendremos de reflexión de todo lo que hoy se trabajó el día de ayer, pues ponerlo a disposición de todos ustedes, y que pueda ser de insumos para diálogos internos institucionales, informar sus acciones, etcétera. Siéntanse en libertad y pueden entregarla a cualquier colega de Food for the Hungry o en la mesa de registro o con mi persona, y será un honor poder continuar estando en contacto y trabajando en conjunto. Solamente quiero afirmar nuestro agradecimiento y nuestro compromiso con la mujer indígena de Guatemala. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Michelle. Tendremos a continuación un espacio para el refrigerio. Quisiéramos dar alguna información previa que puedan salir. Tenemos hasta mediodía para poder validar los parqueos, así que nos gustaría invitarles a todos aquellos que necesitan validar sus parqueos que puedan puedan acercarse a la mesa
So
de registro y ahí les
to
estarán
the
brindando mayor información.
table and they're gonna give you more
Tomaremos
info.
15 minutos para
We're
el
gonna
café
take 10
y
minutes for a
retornamos
coffee
a
break
las
and
10 y
we
5 para
come
continuar
back
con
to
nuestro programa de hoy.
5 to continue with
Tengan
our
un buen
program.
espacio.
Have a nice coffee break.